There are 5 rules we typically talk about when comparing fractions. The first one we're going to talk about is same numerator. Same numerator means the fractions have the same number of parts. So, when you have the same numerator, to compare the fractions, you want to look at the denominators. The smaller the denominator, the larger the pieces. So you would rather share a chocolate bar with 4 people than 6 people because your pieces are going to be larger. Both fractions have 3 parts, however, I would rather have the one that's cut into 4 pieces because my parts are going to be larger than those that are cut into 6 pieces. So we can see that 3/4 is greater than 3/6. Here's another example for same numerator. You have the same number of parts, so you want bigger pieces. I would rather have 2/3 than 2/8 because my pieces are going to be larger. Rule number 2 is same denominator. So when comparing fractions with the same denominator, these fractions have the same size parts. So you want to look at the numerators. The bigger the numerator means it has more pieces. So both chocolate bars are cut into 7 pieces. You want the one with more parts. So you would rather have 5 parts than 3 parts. So remember, you have the same size pieces, so you want more parts. So you would rather have 2/3 than 1/3. The next rule is to compare to 1/2. Comparing to 1/2, you want to look at both fractions. Think, is the numerator more than, less than, or equal to half of the denominator? So for example, 3/4, 3 is more than half of 4 because half of 4 is 2. 3 is greater than 2. 4/8, 4 is equal to half of 8. Since we know 3 is more than half of 4 and 4 is equal to half of 8, we know that 3/4 is greater than 4/8. Another example comparing to 1/2, we have 3/8 and 4/6. Well, half of 8 is 4, so 3 would be less than half. Half of 6 is 3, so we know 4 is greater than 1/2. So 4/6 would be greater than 3/8. The fourth rule we're going to talk about is a unit from a whole. Look at each fraction. We have 2/3 and 4/5. The smaller unit fraction, or the fraction with the bigger denominator, meaning smaller pieces, is closer to one whole. So, for example, 4/5 has smaller pieces, meaning that it has a smaller jump to the next whole. It is closer to the next whole. 2/3 would have a larger jump to complete the whole fraction bar. So therefore, 2/3 is less than 4/5. Are they one unit fraction from a whole? So remember how we talked about the larger the denominator, the smaller the piece? Well, the smaller the piece in this case is going to always give us our larger fraction because it is closer to creating one whole. So if we have 2/3 and 7/8, they are both 1 unit away from a whole, 2 being 1 away from 3, and 7 being 1 away from 8. However, 7/8 is going to have a smaller piece to fill to complete that whole. The last rule is to create equivalent fractions. Create an equivalent fraction so they have a common numerator or denominator, and then you can use rule number 1 or 2. You would need to multiply or divide each fraction by the same numerator and denominator. So in this case, I'm looking at my denominators, 3 and 5. I know both 3 and 5 can go into 15. So I'm going to make my denominators 15. I would have to multiply 1/3 by 5/5 because the 3 times 5 gives me 15 as my denominator. 1 times 5 would give me 5 as my numerator. Looking at 2/5, I know 5 times 3 would give me 15. 2 times 3 would give me 6. So now I am comparing 5/15 to 6/15. Or students can create a ratio table, which in my opinion is an easier strategy to create equivalent fractions. You would set up your fraction 1/3 and 2/5, and then you would skip count by those numbers until you found an equivalent numerator or denominator. In this case, an equivalent denominator showed up first, which is 15. You can box those and you can see that you have 6/15 and 5/15 just by skip counting. Now that we've discussed the 5 rules to comparing fractions, it's important to note that the rules typically get harder from 1 to 5. So what I would recommend to students is to start at number 1. Identify if they have the same numerator. If they do, compare. If they don't, go to rule number 2. Do they have the same denominator? If they do, compare. If not, go to rule number 3. And then keep going like that. This way, students are utilizing the easier strategies before they resort to having to create equivalent fractions.